Hello and welcome. My name is Leslie Anderson, and I'm the Director of Collections, Exhibitions, and Programs at the National Nordic Museum in Seattle. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's virtual book talk for Swedish American Borderlands, New Histories of Transatlantic Relations, which was published by University of Minnesota Press. This book studies the connections between Sweden and the United States from the 17th century to the present day, looking at the exchange of ideas and knowledge. Now, I would like to introduce the authors and co-editors of this book, Drs. Dag Blanck and Adam Hjortén. Dag Blanck is a professor of North American Studies and director of the Swedish Institute for North American Studies at Uppsala University and director of the Swenson Swedish Immigration Research Center at Augustana College. He is the author of The Creation of an Ethnic Identity, Being Swedish American in the Augustana Synod, 1860 to 1917, and he's the recipient of the Carl Sandburg Medal for the Swedish American Historical Society. Adam Hjortén is a senior lecturer in North American Studies at Uppsala University. He received the Lubbock Prize from the Royal Swedish Academy of Letters in 2018 and is author of Cross-Border Commemorations Celebrating Swedish Settlement in America from University of Massachusetts Press, which was published in 2018. I now turn it over to Drs. Blanck and Hjortén.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you for inviting us to do this book talk. My name is Dag Blanck, and I'm here with my co-editor and colleague Adam Hjortén. We're going to do a presentation here for maybe 40 minutes or so about this book. We will go back and forth here between the two of us and talk about the book. And at the end of that, we will have some time for questions from you guys. And I think you know how to submit those questions. You do it through the chat function. Unless that's correct, Leslie will tell us otherwise. So this book that was published last year now, it must have been, right? Yes, in 2021 by the University of Minnesota Press. As you can see here, it's called Swedish American Borderlands, New Histories of Transatlantic Relations. And we get back to the question of borderlands here, what we mean by that. It is a publication of a network of scholars that has been in operation since 2016. And it consists of 16 chapters from 10 disciplines, and there are scholars based in Sweden, Italy, and the US. What we seek to do here in this book, as we say here on the slide, is a reconceptualization and a redefinition of studies of Swedish-American relations. We take a broad approach to different ways in which Sweden and the United States have related to each other over time, over a long period of time. From the book begins in the 17th century with examples from the 17th century and goes up to the almost to the present time. So we're interested in the different ways in which Sweden and the US have been connected and related to each other and influenced each other, and that's the kind of basic. And we try to do this in a new way, of course. Next slide, please. If we want to say something first about the historiography of Swedish-American relations, that is, how have Swedish-American relations been studied over time? The first point is that the migration of Swedes to the New World has played a very important role, and historically been maybe one of the dominant threads in this story. And we certainly acknowledge that and write about it as well. It is not, however, the only type of relation between Sweden and the United States that exists. But if we talk about the migration, the history of the Great Migration of over 1.3 million Swedes to North America in the 19th and 20th century. The way that has been, the history of that migration has been looked at in different ways. The first attempts to write the history of the Swedish immigration to the United States or migration to the United States was made by Swedish Americans themselves in the late 19th century in the United States. And that is what is known as Swedish American filiopietism. Filiopietism, that is not an academic way, not an uncritical way, but it's a way of emphasizing the group's history in America and emphasizing the positive aspects of the group's history in America. It's a way of using that history to integrate in American society, to enhance all the contributions that Swedes had made to American life. That's the filiopietistic phase, all the great men and women, all the great names and so forth. But as I said, uncritical. That phase was replaced in the early 20th century by immigration history, and again by American historians, often of Scandinavian and Swedish background, born in America often, but of Swedish or Scandinavian parents, and persons who knew the languages and persons who had a kind of a cultural knowledge. They started to study the immigration academically in universities and in colleges. University of Minnesota, for example, became a very early place where this was studied, and trying to place Swedish immigrants in the larger framework of immigration to the United States. It's one of many groups, of course, Swedes and other Scandinavians, but also to study different aspects of it, religious aspects of it, political aspects, etc., etc. But it was clearly from an American point of view. The next bullet here is emigration history, and that's what happens when the homeland starts studying this history, and that is fairly late. Historians in Sweden and in Scandinavia were relatively late in coming to this field, especially in Sweden. It was not a glorious part of Swedish history. So many people left, mostly for economic reasons, and it was not a part of standard Swedish history. And it wasn't really until social history, the history of the broader population in Sweden became interesting to historians in the 1950s and especially 60s and 70s, that the emigration became a focus because there were so many people, of course, who had left. And you go to the sources and you see all these people going to America. So when Swedish historians took this up, it was emigration as opposed to immigration. It was from Sweden to America, but the first immigration historians did to America. In recent years, from the 1990s and so forth, and there has been a kind of a cultural turn in the study of the Swedish migration, not just numbers and who they were and why and from where and to where, but also looking at identity issues, ethnicity. How is a sense of ethnicity created? How were they Americanized? How did they fit in? Were they integrated into the new country? What did their ethnic background mean, and how was it maintained? Those are some themes historically in studying the migration. But we also, as I said from the beginning, wish to be broader in our approach, not just the migration. We want to integrate traditionally topics that have been traditionally separate. And we have articles in this book that deal with not just the migration, but culture, film, music, literature, politics, security. We don't have anything on security, but we could have something on security as we look forward. Heritage, economics, religion, and so forth. And by integrating all these different fields, we feel that we can contribute to a larger understanding of Swedish-American relations, where the migration is one part, but there are other parts as well, and they relate to each other, is our argument. Next slide.
So what we're trying to do in this book, then, as Dag was saying, is using this idea, this concept, this notion of borderlands as a kind of a guiding guiding concept, guiding word, guiding principle for this volume. And it might sound sort of counterintuitive, right, of borderlands, since Sweden and the United States obviously does not share a common border, right? But this concept of borderlands has a very long history of itself within American history, within American studies, and there's two, without going into detail on that scholarship and that discussion, there's two dimensions of this idea that we'd like to mention, because we sort of work with them in this book. And the first aspect is what we call this geographic definition of what a borderland is. And in short, it focuses on land, right? Land and the settlement of individuals on that land. This is kind of a traditional definition of borderlands within this field. It's mostly associated with boundaries and frontiers in colonial North American history from the 16th century up to the 19th century, and it's connected to the expanding empires of the Spanish, the French, the British, and of course also the United States empire. And we suggest here in this book that this is also a relevant dimension to use and to think about when studying Swedish American relations. And an important aspect of that is the ways in which Swedish Americans and Swedes as well have been active in encounters with indigenous populations who have negotiated processes of dispossession and depopulation in American history, for example. And the second definition here is more conceptual in nature. It's not as clearly connected to geography, to place, but it's about studies of identities, of ideas, of cultures and knowledges. And so it fundamentally concerns the transnational exchanges and flows across borders. And when we apply this concept to the study of Swedish American relations, we suggest that it has several consequences. And one of those consequences is that it kind of compels us to reconsider the standard narrative of Swedish emigration or immigration history that Dag just sort of gave you a sketch about. So looking at Swedish American relations through this idea of borderlands, there are three categories of individuals or individual movements that we propose that emerge as central. It's the settlers, the migrants, and the sojourners. And so these are people that traveled for different reasons with different objectives, and where their travels had rather different consequences. And a factor to think about here as well is that many of these individuals traveled with different transportation technologies, right? Most settlers traveled by sailing ships, later ocean-going steamships. Most migrants travel also by steamships. Most sojourners, on the other hand, have mostly been traveling by airplane, right? So first, when we can take a brief look at these three categories of individuals. To start off with settlers. These are individuals that moved to North America to acquire land, to settle on that land, often as entire families. And a common theme for these individuals is that they, when they claimed land in that process, they often came into contact with Native American populations. And so in this way, they were part of this long historical process of dispossessing indigenous populations of their land. This include, for example, the earliest Swedes who relocated to North America during colonial era, beginning with the New Sweden colony that was founded in 1638 along the shores of the Delaware River. Really a short-lived venture. Was seized by the Dutch in 1655, and at its height, it only had slightly less than 400 people that lived there from Sweden and from present-day Finland. And sometimes this colony is talked about as an early form of immigration, but we think it's important to also point out that it wasn't. It was a colonial settlement that was similar in form, though not in size, to other European colonies in America during the 17th century. But it also includes individuals who became agents in the United States westward expansion during the 19th century. So people who settled west of the Mississippi River, the protagonists of Vilhelm Moberg's famous novels, The Emigrants, for example, were in our argument here actually settlers. And in some areas, Swedish and other Scandinavian settlers continue this process of Indian dispossession well into the 20th century by taking advantage of the opportunity to purchase land on Native American reservations. You see here on the right, for example, an image, it's a plat map from the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation in North Dakota. And I apologize for the tiny print, but if you were to see the prints, the fine printed names, you would see they're printed on the allotments here on this reservation. You would see names that are both indigenous and Scandinavian. And so in certain places, like on this reservation, this process continued as long as into the 1920s. And in total, during this long era of settlement, around 160,000 individuals left Sweden and settled in America. Dag.
Okay, then we come to the second category of movements, individual movements that we think are so important here, and that is the migrants. We call them migrants from circa 1880 and up until the present time. We have migrants today as well. These are people, if the settlers were people in search of land in different ways and who settled on land, these are people who mainly migrated to the big industrial centers in the United States. As the United States is industrialized very rapidly from the latter part of the 19th century, after the Civil War in particular, of course, the huge growth of cities like Chicago and eastern industrial cities, but eventually also, of course, in the Pacific Northwest with Seattle, attracted a great number of Swedes who left from Sweden basically for economic and social reasons. There was one of the fundamental factors behind the outpouring of Swedes to the United States was, of course, the rapid population growth in Sweden, which was quite rapid, and it created pressure on the economic resources of the country, a country which was by and large still very agricultural and rooted in agriculture, and that it became more and more problematic to sustain this quickly growing population of young people in particular. And the migration to the United States became one option here to industrial centers. So it became in large part a labor migration, seeking work in growing American urban areas and the growing American industry. And of course, the United States had a need, and the growing cities, the growing industry had a need for people. And in Europe and in Sweden, there was a pressure on the resources. So it was, in some sense, a fortunate combination here for the U.S. by and large received Scandinavians, and they were able to enter and were able to find a foothold in the rapidly growing urban and industrial economies. And that took some pressure off the land of the situation in Sweden. This is not to say that everything was rosy and everything was happy. They also became a part of the industrial economy and of the slums and poverty and unrest, labor unrest and strikes and so forth that we are familiar with when we think about the growing American industrial economy. Adam mentioned Vilhelm Moberg's novels, The Emigrants, which then deals with the early settlers, as we call them, settling on the land in Minnesota. The protagonists there, Carl Oscar and Christina, you may be familiar with them, and very emblematic, and for a long time became the emblematic representatives of Swedish immigrants in the United States. A couple of years ago, maybe now 10 years ago, another novel was published by an Uppsala author, a good friend of mine actually, Ola Larsmo, who wrote a novel called Swede Hollow. It has a title Swede Hollow in Swedish. It has an English title in Swedish, and that is about Swedish migrants settling in the industrial economy of St. Paul, Minnesota, working on the railroads in particular, and other industries as well in St. Paul. And that novel paints a very different picture of the migration and of the immigrants, and they take place only 40, 50 miles from each other in the Moberg novels up in Chisago County, north of the Twin Cities, and the Larsmo novel in St. Paul. But they capture these two very different aspects of the migration. And that novel has here in Sweden become very popular. Both novels, both Moberg and Larsmo, deal with a theme that is so central still in Swedish history, in Swedish consciousness. It resonates very strongly. And the Swede Hollow has been translated. Larsmo's novel has been translated also into English and available for purchase in the U.S. Also, these migrants from the 80s and onwards, and of course we have people still moving to the United States from Sweden, seeking employment, essentially being a part of today's industrial or post-industrial society. And in Seattle, not least, you have many people working in the high-tech industry, for example, in Microsoft and so forth. You had people coming to Seattle in the 50s working for Boeing, the Boeing Swedes, and now we have the Microsoft Swedes and so forth. But we still have this ongoing tendency. One important part here of this for the migrants of this type of migration is the return migration. That is an understudied area, I would say, but all migrations really of this nature, at least when we come to these types of migrants, result in return migration. Migration is a circular movement. Once people start moving, people will go back as well. And that was true for Swedes as well. Overall, maybe it's estimated maybe that 18 to 20% of all Swedes did eventually return to Sweden after a shorter or a longer period of time, and did so. Maybe their goals had been achieved. I mean, one goal was to improve their economic and social status, and some could and were able to bring back resources, not just financial resources, but all kinds of other things were brought back too, ideas, ways of thinking, technologies and so forth. And especially those, and many did return to the point of origin, to the smaller communities in Sweden. And these returnees became a prominent part of the local culture. There was always a Swedish American somewhere around. Oh yeah, there's the Swedish American. Maybe they spoke with a little English in their language, and maybe they brought a car back. Maybe they had special technology. There was a sense of a part of America having come back or having come to Sweden through these returnees. And this is not unique to Sweden. This is true for all the European migration countries. Look at Italy, for example, a fantastic example of many, many returnees and the impact they play. So these migrants, labor migration to the industrial centers, then a very important part of these individual movements, part of the growing, changing industrial economies on both sides of the Atlantic. And about 1 million, we estimate here, from the 1870s to the 1920s. Next slide, please.
Yeah, as Dag said, there are these stories, right, about Swedish settlers, about Swedish migrants, but there's one third category of individuals that have been very influential, we think, in Swedish American relations, and that fairly long history, and that is this category of individuals that we call sojourners, because not everyone, of course, traveled that made this Atlantic crossing can be labeled settlers or migrants. There were also those who have traveled for other reasons, such as leisure, education, for science, for business. One of the very earliest example of such a traveler from Sweden was the botanist and naturalist Per Kalm, for example, who visited North America in the late 1740s. He was one of Carl Linnaeus' students at Uppsala University, and a significant proportion of the Swedes that left for the United States in the first half of the 19th century were this category of travelers. And a prominent example of that is, as you see in the picture on the upper right-hand side here, Fredrika Bremer, for example. She visited the United States in 1849 and to 1851, traveling extensively around the country and meeting many prominent intellectuals of their time, such as Longfellow and Hawthorne and so forth. And after her return to Sweden, she published a book, Hemmen I den nya världen, just very quickly translated into English as Homes of the New World, came out in 1853, I think. That became really prominent and important book about mid 19th century United States. And she was again not a migrant, not a settler, right? She was this temporary traveler that came back to Sweden bearing these ideas about the United States. And this group has had a very significant impact, not least since the Second World War. Between 2008 and 2017, Swedes accounted for an average of about 530,000 arrivals to the United States under a non-immigrant status. And it's interesting to compare that figure, the volume of migration, to this volume of temporary travelers, of sojourners. In 1887, for example, which is the peak year of Swedish mass emigration to the United States, the number of migrants in 1887 represented slightly more than 1% of the Swedish population at that time. And as a comparison, the number of Swedish arrivals to the United States in 2015 amounted to more than 6% of the Swedish population in 2015. So it's a significant number and amount of individuals that have traveled between the countries on a temporary basis. But the question is then what effects that these movements have had on Sweden, on the United States, on Swedish American relations. And our proposition in this volume is that the movements of individuals have been intrinsically connected to circulation of ideas, of knowledges, of cultures. And maybe we want to say something briefly about that, Dag, so we'll have time to say something about our sort of examples soon. Do you want to say something about these? These are some examples from chapters, I believe, from the book, right?
Yes, they are. And as Adam says, our argument is that there's all these different types of movements, individual movements of settlers and migrants and sojourners. They are very important because they contribute to a circulation between the two countries of ideas, knowledge, culture, in many different ways and in many different spheres. And we have here some examples of themes that are covered in the book. All of them are rooted in some kind of a movement and linked to individuals. And these are the types of circulations that we have seen and encounters that we have: Swedish indigenous encounters, jazz, the arrival of jazz music to Sweden, design and urban planning, a very interesting chapter on how Sweden looked to the United States for urban planning and how the United States looked to Sweden for modern urban solutions, and through individuals who traveled, through architects and city planners. We have cookbooks, Swedish American cookbooks, as an example of a circulation of ideas through individuals who moved from Sweden to US, we have film culture, for example, Ingmar Bergman, the circulation of Bergman back and forth, the reception of Bergman in the United States, very strong. We have Civil War reenactments, believe it or not, American Civil War reenactments in Sweden. That's an interesting circulation. Discourses of political correctness, the American discourses of political correctness that have arrived or did arrive, circulated into Sweden, and academic exchanges and so forth. So movements lead to circulation. Circulation of ideas, knowledge, and culture is an argument that we're trying to drive home here in this book.
And during the last couple of minutes of this presentation, we're going to say something about the two chapters that Dag and I have contributed to this volume. And my contribution is about the history of Swedish American genealogy, family history, which is an important aspect of Swedish American relations. I think the actual relations between individuals, right? The connections of family, of ancestry, and of course, you know, these processes that we've been talking about now, large-scale settlement, migration, have created this substantial body of people in the United States that claim and can claim Swedish ancestry. And the number of people today, it's a roughly 4.3 million people that claim Swedish ancestry in the United States today. And as many of you may know, this culture of actively researching that transatlantic ancestry has grown into a popular movement today. It's also become big business, right? An industry of genealogical companies, digital platforms, and the direct-to-consumer DNA tests. Genetic genealogy has become a really big thing during the last 10 to 20 years. But it's important to think about the fact that the family history has not always been popular. It hasn't always been around in this way that we think about it today and that we encounter it today. In 1950, for example, we've been mentioning Willem Moberg now a couple of times, and a year after the first volume of The Emigrants came out, he wrote this book in Swedish called Den okända släkten. And it was many years later that it was translated into English as The Unknown Swedes was the name that it received. And his message in that book was that there was this substantial group of people in the US to whom people in Sweden were related by blood. And in one chapter of the book, for example, it describes his own experience of meeting and visiting distant relatives in California. And you know, he exaggerated it a little bit when he called them the unknown Swedes in the United States. But when he wrote this book in the late 1940s, he was basically right that very few people in Sweden or in the United States were actively researching their ancestry at this time. Family history was not a very big thing compared with today. But this began to change in the decades after the Second World War. I'm sure that many of you remember or recognize this book and this author and TV series, right? And there were several reasons for why genealogy became this popular movement, mainly from the 1970s onward. And on an international scale, this book, Roots, The Saga of an American Family by author Alex Haley from 1976 had a very big impact. It came as in the following year out as this was released as a blockbuster miniseries. And it stirred what has become known as the Roots phenomenon in the United States. Also in Sweden, släktrötter became a sort of standard phrase in Swedish and in Sweden to describe genealogy. But there's something in my chapter in my research that I wanted to focus a bit on too, which is that a reason for why family history could grow into this popular movement was because, you know, unlike when Willem Moberg wrote his book in the 1940s, genealogical research during the last 50, 60 years has become much more easier. cheaper and faster to do because of new technologies that have been developed. And perhaps the most important one in the mid-20th century was microfilm, which, and there's one organization that was at the forefront of that development, which was the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And the Mormon Church has been and is still today the organization that has invested most money and most energy on family history on a global scale. And they started this microfilming program in 1938, but it expanded significantly after the Second World War. And one area where it expanded was in Sweden in 1948 and ending in 1963. The church microfilmed all church records in Sweden. And since the Lutheran State Church in Sweden had collected vital statistics, data on Swedish population ever since the 17th century, these records were a really treasure trove for Mormons and for others that wanted to trace relatives to Sweden. And so when that microfilming program ended in the mid-1960s, the church had microfilmed over 24 million records, which at that point made Sweden the most well-represented country in the church, really at that point, expansive collections. And by the mid-1960s, they had collected such a massive amount of microfilm that they needed to build a new repository for it, that they blasted into the mountain outside of Salt Lake City, the Granite Mountain Records Vault that you see images of here, which is still around as well. But a result of this microfilming was that all of a sudden, Salt Lake City grew into this site that was the best place in the world to do genealogical research in general, but also specifically for doing Swedish American research. So from the late 1960s, for Swedish Americans that wanted to trace their ancestry in Sweden, it was actually you can argue a better place in many ways to go to Salt Lake City than to go to Sweden to do that genealogical research. And as you can see from the pamphlet here on the right-hand side, there were group trips and workshops that evolved specifically for Swedish American genealogy that started to be arranged in Salt Lake City. And these workshops are still around, organized out of the center that Dag is a director of in Rock Island, Illinois. It happens yearly every fall. And these microfilms I should mention too, that the Mormon Church digitized, that they microfilmed, they are today digitized and made available on Family Search, the platform that the LDS Church runs and operates. Okay, Doug.
Okay, a final example here of Swedish-American relations and of exchanges are academic exchanges, the intellectual Swedish-American borderlands. Also very connected to individual movements of scholars and students traveling back and forth across the Atlantic. And here we give examples of Swedes going to the United States. That's by far the largest flow. Many, many more Swedes go to the US than the other way around. And the United States is, of course, the most popular destination today for international students. If you're studying outside your own country, the #1 destination is the US worldwide, and still also the case for Sweden. And you can see here that in 2018-19, there were 4,400 Swedish students in the US. These statistics are not easy to get at, and there can be more. It wonders if they are registered in a correct way or so forth. International postdocs, if you look at those who are going for a postdoc after they done their PhD on Swedish money from the Swedish Research Council, there the US is also the most popular destination. So the United States is a very, of course, strong, the intellectual powerhouse of the world, we can say. American universities, research institutes, are very interesting for all of the world and for Swedes. And there are a number of foundations and organizations supporting this. I mentioned here the Sweden America Foundation, which was founded in 1919 and has supported Swedish scholarships and Swedish scholars in all fields of study, but in particular in technology, social science, and in the life sciences. And these academic exchanges have been of great significance for the Swedish university world, for the Swedish academic world. Next slide. And here is an example of such a connection. This is a telegram that was sent in 1937 from Boston, Mass. You can see at the top line, it says Boston, Mass, in the 5th of November in 1937, sent by a Swedish, world-famous Swedish chemist, Svedberg, T.S. Svedberg, Nobel laureate, sending back to his student, also a Nobel laureate eventually, Tiselius, Arne Tiselius, at Chemicum, the chemistry department in Uppsala, with one P, as it was spelled then. That's the destination. And the message is, make electrophoresis apparatus for Kohn. And Professor Kohn was at Harvard. And this was a special tool that had been designed by the chemists in Uppsala, and it had become very important in many respects. It became important for blood plasma and had all kinds of scientific applications, and especially during World War II became very important. And here is Svedberg is in America. He's at Harvard visiting with his friends, colleagues there, sends a telegram back to Tiselius in Uppsala, make the electrophoresis apparatus for Kohn and send it to him. So these links also go the other way, actually. Swedish academic life and Swedish academic achievements also play an important role in the United States. But these academic exchanges are one very important part of these Swedish-American relations. Next slide. And here you can see one quote from one of the students who came over with the Sweden America Foundation, Per Westberg, who has become a very famous Swedish author, member of the Swedish Academy. And when he came in 1952 or 53 to Harvard, and he writes in his autobiography of his experiences, he found he could choose from courses from a multitude that one could only dream of at a Swedish university. I remember the 2 years as the most rewarding in my life. Next slide. And here you see another famous Swede who spent a year at Kenyon College as an undergraduate at Kenyon College in Ohio, number 32, and that is our former Prime Minister Olof Palme, who came as a young man to America and became very, very shaped by those years in the United States. Next slide. That was it. So let me just say, the academic aspect, especially all the undergraduates who come over, that is American soft power at its best. I was such a person myself, came to Augustana College in Illinois at age 19, and it shaped my life. It opened up America to me, and it is a fantastically interesting way of creating links and exchanges between countries. And now Adam takes it away.
Yeah, to say some sort of concluding words here about our volume and our presentation. I think that we think that thinking about Swedish-American relations sort of writ large and studying it through borderlands, this idea about borderlands, has significantly enlarged the scope of what constitutes Swedish-American relations. So studies of migration, for example, have and will always have a significant position in the field, but it's no longer necessarily the central area of study. And with that being said, the chapters of the volume also show the persistent role of individual movements across the Atlantic, of migrants, of settlers, of sojourners. And it is important to acknowledge that this has been tied up with changing transportation and communication technologies. Dag just gave this example of the telegram, for example, right, which have affected the ability to move between the countries, but also to communicate and to foster different kinds of transatlantic exchanges. We think, though, that something has happened as well with the introduction of the internet in the 1990s. And now, for example, right, in the age of Zoom, both Dag and I are talking to you here today from 2 different locations in Stockholm, which is fantastic. We'd rather be in Seattle, I'm sure. But
Yes.
but the question is then, right, whether transatlantic relations, Swedish American relations, are currently undergoing a dramatic transformation, maybe, where these kinds of individual movements cease to be as crucial as they have been in earlier times, right? Now we can communicate in different ways. All right, thank you for your attention.
So thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'd like to open it up to the audience to ask questions, which they can do through the Q&A function, but there have been a couple in the chat bar. I'll first start with asking about the genesis of this book. So this book was several years in the making. Can you tell us a little bit about how it came to be and the process of developing it, for instance, in selecting the themes represented?
Hold on.
Well, so it became with the conversations that Dag and I have had across the last several years. Of, on the one hand, I mean, so if you look for scholars that research Swedish American history or Swedish immigration history, there aren't that many out there today that work on immigration or immigration history. But if you broaden the lens and you think about Swedish American relations as different kinds of cultural, political, social, economic, and so forth aspects of what is considered to be Swedish American, right? It's not only about immigration or about ethnicity and things associated to that, right? So if you broaden that lens, you or at least we found that there was actually quite a few people that were working on this in different fields, right? So that's one way in which this started. We tried to get more people under this umbrella of what constitutes studies of Swedish American relations today. And then we also wanted to try to focus on these, to not only look at what's happening within the United States, to not only look at what's happening within Sweden, but to actually focus on the sort of spaces in between, right, on the crossings in different ways across the Atlantic. And so that is how we came to this concept of borderlands and wanted to try to see where that led us, where that could take us. And it's taken us to this great group of individuals, of scholars. I think there's 30 or so that at some point during this process have been involved in these conversations. We've had workshops and conferences and so forth. And close to 20 of them who we're very happy are part of this book and could make it the volume that it has become.
Thank you. Are there any stories, additional stories of contacts, crossings, or convergences that were revealed in the process of working on this book that you're exploring further, perhaps for future projects?
I can say something there. These academic ties, I've been working on these academic ties for a long time. And I'm continuing to do that. I think that one theme that has emerged and that I touched upon is the return migration. These Swedes who came back from America to Sweden. That is, as I said, understudied, and I'm trying to encourage my students in Uppsala to work on that, and I'm doing a little work on that off and on myself. I do think that this impact that group had in Sweden, it also helps us understand the strong Swedish orientation to the United States today. Anyone who visits the U.S., visits Sweden from the U.S. and who has an interest in this will note how Sweden is very oriented towards the United States. Perhaps Americanized is a word that is sometimes used. It's a little pejorative, but nevertheless. And certainly the United States is such a powerful presence, and culturally and politically and so forth. But we have been, particularly in Sweden, prone to receive impulses from America, it is sometimes argued. And I think that the returnees play an important role. They came back with personal experiences and left imprints in Swedish society, and paved the way, so to speak, or increased the awareness of America in Sweden in a particular way. So you see a combination there of the migration, the history of the migration, and how that is linked to other American presences in Sweden, how it helps an American presence in Sweden. And I think that's quite interesting. You could also go the other way and look to the United States, where you have a Swedish presence in the United States, much weaker, of course. As we should say, this is a very asymmetrical relationship. You know, the US is the big, powerful part of this. But if you go to part of the United States, such as the Pacific Northwest or other parts in the Middle West, you will see an awareness of Sweden in an interesting way. And that is also then linked to this migration.
Thank you. There are a few more questions that have been entered into the chat. So one asks if anyone has studied the influence of a large Swedish population on the politics of particular states, for example, the more egalitarian approach in Minnesota.
Yes. There have been discussions about that. The specific Minnesota politics, maybe some perceive it as being more progressive or egalitarian, if that is linked to current Swedish, say, politics that are perceived to be perhaps egalitarian or progressive. I don't buy that argument myself, because the Minnesota politics was shaped by immigrants who came in the late 19th century and early 20th century, before Sweden had undergone that transformation. There might be some. I've done some work. You can see Senator Humphrey from Minnesota, Vice President Humphrey, and Walter Mondale, of course, with Norwegian background. They were very interested in what was going on in Scandinavia and the welfare states in Scandinavia. They were progressive Democrats, and they were advocates of that. If that was because of their ethnicities is a very open question. I think most Swedish immigrants, at least, coming to the United States, were very much shaped by America. Their political preferences became shaped by their experience in the United States. Some were radicals, and there were lots of radicals, but that was not necessarily, I think, because of their Swedish experiences. That was of their experiences in the United States, in the progressive movement and in the labor movement and so forth. Today, we may want to read into the kind of Nordic progressivism into Scandinavian Americans now and Scandinavian Americans then. It's an interesting thought, but a difficult argument to make, I think.
We have another question. It's very timely. Given the current geopolitical situation, how likely is Sweden to join the US and jump into NATO?
I'll leave that to all of them.
Well, I was going to say the same.
Leave it to you.
No, leave it to you, Doug. I really can't comment on that, to be honest. Doug, what is your take?
Well, this morning in Dagens Nyheter, the leading Swedish newspaper, there's an op-ed piece by the leader of the Swedish Conservative Party, the opposition. We have an election coming up in September, and he says, if I am the leader of the next Swedish government, I will submit an application for NATO membership if there is a majority for that in the Swedish parliament. The opinion here has shifted dramatically in the last several weeks. And NATO membership is being talked about in a way that it has not been for a very long time. If that means that Sweden is actually going to join NATO, it's hard to say. It depends, but certainly there's more discussion of it, and there's a strong sense of concern about what is going on with Russia. Russia has always been a presence, of course, for us historically. And in recent decades, much less so. But now we have learned that Russia hasn't gone away. So there's also a great deal of emphasis on rearming Sweden, strengthening our military forces. And the island from which Adam comes, Gotland, sitting there in the middle of the Baltic, has become a very strategic point in Swedish thinking again.
So I think we have time for one more question, but I want to thank our audience for submitting a number of wonderful questions, and we can collect those and send them over if you'd like. They are, the last question is, Sweden has an ethical term for its norm of collectivity and equity. Does your book discuss how immigrants faced America's deep individualism, which is the opposite?
There are some ways of thinking about that, in that the United States is, of course, then in the 19th century and early 20th century, a very individualistic country, still today a very individualistic country. Sweden has become more individualistic in the 20th century. So I think it depends a little bit upon your points of comparison. I think the Swedish immigrants who came to the United States, settlers, settlers or migrants, whatever they were, they became rather quickly influenced by, they had to become influenced by American, they were influenced by American society, and a greater degree of individualism developed among many of these immigrants, and especially among their children. I think that in the second generation, you see, if you were to try to measure this, there's no article in the book that specifically measures it, but if you were to try to measure the degree of individualism experienced among Swedish Americans, you will see that it is in the second generation and in the third and subsequent generation when that very strong trait of Americanism comes through. And you see it when you see Swedish Americans coming to Sweden today, visiting or returning, or how you want to put it. You see that the one of the misunderstandings between Sweden and Swedish America today has to do with the role of collectivism versus individualism. Americans of Swedish background in the third, fourth, fifth generations, some of the things they see in Sweden today may seem strange, and that is rooted, I think, in that difference. And vice versa, when Swedes come to the United States to visit relatives, and they think that they, as Adam points out, there's a lot of genealogy and ancestry relations here, but there are also a great deal of misunderstandings. There's a fantastic book by the late historian Arnold Barton called A Folk Divided, which deals with how Swedes viewed Swedish Americans and how Swedish Americans viewed Swedes, homeland Swedes. And his idea is that you had a folk, a people in Sweden, and it's divided throughout migration. So we have one part in America and one part in Sweden, and they develop in different ways. They have a lot in common, obviously. There are lots of ties between them, but there are also lots of differences as they go in different paths. He has an expression. He says it's the relationship is characterized as a century of misunderstandings between Sweden and Swedish America, because you think that we have so much in common because we have common ethnic roots, so to speak, and we do. There are commonalities, but there are also great differences. And this issue, individualism versus collectivism, if you want to put it that way, I think is one factor that explains these differences. I don't know what you say, Adam.
Well, considering that it's 1 minute left, I think I agree with that. Good summary.
I want to thank you, Dag Blanck and Adam Hjortén, for opening or expanding this field of scholarship and your contributions through Swedish American Borderlands. I also want to thank you for your time today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Tack, tack.
Bye-bye.
Tack.